Let me start with something most people don't realize they're doing. Some forgiveness is not about compassion, it is about hope. There are people who give second chances to those who have already shown them exactly who they are. They forgive the friend who betrays trust repeatedly. They return to the partner who keeps choosing themselves over the relationship. They extend understanding to the person who apologizes beautifully but changes nothing. And if this feels familiar, it's probably because at some point in life, hoping for change became safer than accepting the truth. This isn't about kindness, it isn't about loyalty, and it definitely isn't about naivety. It's about psychology. People who give second chances to the wrong people are often deeply perceptive. They notice patterns, they track behavior, they see the inconsistencies clearly, sometimes more clearly than anyone else in their life. Their mind is constantly processing evidence, cataloguing moments, comparing words to actions. But somewhere in that process, something shifts. The evidence gets reframed, the pattern becomes potential, the history becomes a story that could still change its ending. What makes this different from healthy forgiveness is not the act itself. Healthy forgiveness happens after harm, after accountability, after demonstrated change. It's a response to growth. But this pattern operates differently. It gives chances before change occurs. It offers trust in advance of evidence. It forgives not what has been repaired, but what might someday be repaired. The distinction is subtle but significant. One responds to reality, the other responds to possibility. For many people, this habit doesn't feel like a choice. It feels like who they are. They describe themselves as understanding, as patient, as someone who sees the best in others. And those things may be true, but beneath that identity is usually something else. A learned response, an adaptation, a strategy that once kept them safe, or at least kept them connected, and now operates automatically even when safety and connection are no longer at risk. They give second chances to the person who cancels plans repeatedly, but always has a reason. They forgive the family member who criticizes them constantly but occasionally shows warmth. They stay close to the friend who takes but rarely gives, telling themselves that everyone has struggles. They return to the relationship where apologies arrive like clockwork, but behavioral change never does. And each time they tell themselves this chance will be different. This time, the person will see how much effort has been invested. This time, the pattern will break, but the pattern doesn't break. It deepens. What's interesting is that people who do this are not operating from ignorance. They're operating from something more complex. They have often spent years analysing the person, understanding their history, explaining their behaviour, constructing psychological frameworks that make the harm feel less intentional. They become experts in empathy. They can articulate why the person acts the way they do, what childhood wound drives the behaviour, what fear prevents the change. This understanding feels like love. It feels like depth. But understanding why someone causes harm is not the same as accepting that harm as inevitable. There's also a specific thought pattern that reinforces this. When someone gives too many second chances, they often focus on moments rather than patterns. They remember the good conversation, the genuine apology, the kind gesture. Those moments feel true. They feel like evidence of who the person really is beneath the harmful behaviour. The mind starts to categorize the person into two versions, the one who causes harm and the one who shows up occasionally with care. And the belief forms quietly that if enough second chances are given, the second version will become permanent. This belief is rarely conscious. It doesn't announce itself. It operates beneath awareness, shaping decisions before logical thought catches up. When the person causes harm again, the mind doesn't immediately register betrayal. It registers surprise, disappointment, confusion. The question becomes not, why do they keep doing this? But what did I miss? What could I have done differently? What will make this time different? Psychologically, this connects to something deeply human. The brain doesn't like unfinished patterns. It seeks resolution. It wants the story to make sense. When someone shows moments of potential mixed with consistent harm, the brain experiences tension. The two versions don't align, and rather than accept the contradiction, the mind often chooses hope. Hope that the pattern will resolve toward the positive. Hope that the potential will win. Hope that the investment of chances will eventually produce the change that hasn't come. Somewhere along the way, usually early in life, these individuals learned that people are not fixed. They learned that behavior can shift. They learned that love, patience, and understanding can sometimes create transformation. And those things are true, but they also learned something else, something less obvious. They learned that holding on to hope feels better than accepting loss, that waiting for change feels more active than acknowledging reality, that giving another chance feels like control in situations where control doesn't actually exist. This adaptation often forms in environments where consistency was rare, where a parent, caregiver, or important figure alternated between warmth and withdrawal, between presence and absence, between harm and repair. In those environments, children learn to focus on the good moments because those moments provide relief. They learn to minimize the harm because acknowledging it fully would make the relationship unbearable. They learn that loyalty to the person's potential matters more than protection from their pattern. The brain adapts. It doesn't reject the person. It doesn't cut them off. It learns to hope strategically, to forgive preemptively, to extend chances as a way of maintaining connection. Because connection, even painful connection, once felt safer than abandonment. And over time, this response stops feeling like a strategy. It becomes identity. Not a conscious choice to give chances, but an automatic response to harm. Not a decision to forgive, but a reflex that activates before thought completes. The person doesn't think, should I give another chance? They think, how can I help them see they're capable of change? The question shifts from whether to how, and in that shift the answer becomes inevitable. There's another layer here that matters. Many people who give too many second chances carry a quiet belief about their own role. They believe that if they're patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, they can be the catalyst for someone else's growth, that their presence, their faith, their unwavering belief in the person's potential will be the thing that finally makes transformation possible. This belief feels generous, it feels loving, but it also places enormous responsibility on the giver and very little on the receiver. What's also true is that these individuals are often thoughtful, conscientious, emotionally intelligent. They're not careless with their forgiveness. They're not reckless. They think deeply before each chance. They weigh the evidence. They consider the person's circumstances. They replay conversations, searching for signs of genuine remorse versus performed remorse. The problem is not a lack of thought. The problem is that all that thought gets filtered through a single lens. The belief that change is always possible if hope is strong enough. They carry a sense of responsibility that extends beyond their actions into the emotional territory of others. Not just What did I do? But what could I have done to prevent this? What am I? Missing that would make this work. They take ownership not just of their choices, but of the other person's growth, as if patience and chance giving are the missing ingredients that will finally produce change. This isn't about weakness. It's not about being too nice or too soft. It's about a psychological pattern where hope becomes a tool for managing the pain of reality, where second chances become a way to delay the grief of accepting that someone is choosing not to change, where forgiveness becomes less about repair and more about control over an outcome that cannot be controlled. Somewhere along the way, they learned something that changed how they process betrayal, not through a single event, but through a pattern that taught them hope was less painful than grief. For many people, this learning began early, in childhood environments where love felt conditional, where approval depended not on who they were, but on how they responded, where forgiveness was not a choice, but a requirement for maintaining connection. In those spaces, second chances were not generosity, they were survival. When a child grows up with a caregiver who alternates between warmth and coldness, affection and distance, care and neglect, something specific happens in the brain. The child cannot leave. The child cannot choose different parents. The child cannot control the adult's behavior. So the child adapts. The mind learns to focus on the good moments as evidence of what's real. The harmful moments become aberrations, mistakes, bad days, things that will pass if the child is patient enough, good enough, forgiving enough. This is where the pattern forms, not in a single traumatic event, but in the quiet accumulation of inconsistency. The parent who rages one day and is tender the next. The caregiver who criticizes harshly but occasionally offers praise. The adult who withdraws emotionally for weeks and then returns with warmth, as if nothing happened. The child's nervous system learns that people exist in two versions, and the version that causes harm is temporary. The version that shows love is the truth waiting to emerge. The brain doesn't frame it this way consciously, but it encodes a belief. People who hurt you still love you. Distance doesn't mean abandonment. Harm doesn't mean the relationship is unsafe. It just means you need to wait. You need to be patient. You need to give another chance for the good version to return. Over time, the child stops questioning whether the pattern will change. The question becomes when. How long until the parent stabilizes? How much patience is required? What behavior from the child will finally make the adult consistent? The child becomes hypervigilant to signs of the good version. A smile, a kind word, a moment of presence. These become proof, evidence that the real person is still there, just hidden temporarily beneath stress, exhaustion, or circumstance. This is not a conscious strategy. It's an adaptation. When safety depends on a person who is unpredictable, the brain learns to predict by hope. It scans for potential rather than pattern. It measures not what has happened, but what could happen if conditions align, if the child is good enough, if the timing is right, if external pressures ease. The mind constructs explanations for the harm that make it temporary, fixable, and separate from the person's core identity. What the child learns is that keeping someone close requires managing their inconsistency without complaint. It means accepting the harm as part of the package. It means treating good moments as the real relationship and bad moments as interruptions. It means giving chance after chance because expressing hurt, anger, or boundaries might cause the person to leave permanently. And permanent loss feels more dangerous than ongoing harm. In these environments, forgiveness is not about repair, it's about maintenance. The child forgives not because the adult has changed or apologized meaningfully, but because forgiveness keeps the connection alive. The nervous system calculates harm with presence is better than safety with abandonment. So the brain adapts. It doesn't reject inconsistency. It learns to accommodate it. It treats unpredictability as normal and consistency as unrealistic. There's a specific psychological phenomenon that reinforces this learning, though most people don't know the name for it. When affection and harm are unpredictable, when love is given intermittently rather than consistently, the attachment becomes stronger, not weaker. The brain forms a more intense bond to someone who is sometimes warm and sometimes cold than to someone who is consistently warm. Because unpredictability creates hope, and hope creates vigilance, and vigilance creates investment. The child raised in this environment learns to treasure the good moments more intensely because they feel rare, earned, and fragile. A parent's unexpected kindness feels more valuable than a consistent parent's steady love. The child starts to believe that the good moments are proof of effort, of being worthy, of finally getting it right. And when the harm returns, the child doesn't think, "This person is harmful." The child thinks, "What did I do wrong? How can I get back to the good version?" This is where second chances become reflexive. When a child learns that people have two versions and the good version appears only sometimes, the child also learns that giving up means never seeing the good version again. So the child holds on, forgives quickly, focuses on potential, waits for the next good moment, and that waiting becomes a skill, a pattern, a lens through which all relationships are eventually filtered. By the time this person reaches adulthood, the pattern is deeply embedded. They don't consciously remember the learning. They just notice that they seem to attract people who are inconsistent. Partners who are loving one week and distant the next. Friends who are supportive sometimes and dismissive other times. Family members who criticize constantly but occasionally show care. And each time, the same response activates. Focus on the good, forgive the bad, give another chance. Wait for the good version to stabilize. They don't realize they're repeating a childhood adaptation. They think they're being understanding, mature, compassionate. They think they see something in the person that others miss. And maybe they do. Maybe they see potential accurately. But what they don't see clearly is the difference between potential and choice, between capacity and willingness, between what someone could do and what someone is choosing to do. What also happens in these early environments is that the child learns to take responsibility for other people's emotional states. If the parent is angry, the child wonders what they did to cause it. If the parent is distant, the child tries to fix it. If the parent is inconsistent, the child believes their own behavior can create consistency. This belief doesn't disappear in adulthood, it transfers. The adult continues to believe that if they're patient enough, understanding enough, forgiving enough, they can stabilize the other person. They can be the reason someone finally changes. But this logic contains a flaw. It assumes that change is prevented by a lack of chances, a lack of patience, or a lack of belief. It assumes that people who cause harm are waiting for the right person to give them permission to grow. And sometimes that's true. Sometimes people do change when they feel seen and supported. But more often, people change when they face consequences, when the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the discomfort of growth. And when someone gives infinite second chances, there's no cost. there's only continuation. In childhood, there's no choice. The child cannot enforce consequences. The child cannot leave. The child must adapt to survive the environment they're given. But in adulthood, this same strategy that once kept the child connected now keeps the adult trapped. The pattern that once protected now prevents protection. Because giving someone endless chances doesn't create safety. It creates a dynamic where harm is forgiven faster than it can be processed. There's another element here. In these early environments, children often learn that expressing hurt or anger is dangerous, that naming harm causes the relationship to fracture, that setting boundaries leads to punishment, withdrawal, or rejection. So instead of expressing pain, the child learns to manage it eternally, to minimize it, to forgive it quickly so it doesn't create distance, and this becomes automatic. When someone causes harm, the first instinct is not "this hurt me," but "how can I keep this from becoming a problem?" By adulthood, this person may not even recognize when they're minimizing harm. It happens so quickly. The friend cancels plans again, and before disappointment fully lands, the mind supplies an explanation. They're going through something. Everyone struggles. I shouldn't take it personally. The partner criticizes them in front of others, and the justification arrives instantly. They're stressed. They didn't mean it that way. I'm probably being too sensitive. The family member dismisses their accomplishments, and the thought completes itself. That's just how they are. They show love differently. It doesn't mean they don't care. These thoughts feel like understanding. They feel like emotional maturity. But they're often remnants of a childhood strategy, a way of making the intolerable tolerable, a way of staying connected to someone whose behavior would otherwise be unbearable. And each justification, each minimization, each quick forgiveness reinforces the pattern. It tells the brain that harm is not serious enough to warrant change, that second chances are unlimited, that the person's potential matters more than their pattern. What's interesting is that people who give too many second chances are not naive. They're not blind to red flags. In fact, they often see them more clearly than anyone else. They notice the inconsistencies. They track the broken promises. They feel the repeated harm. But seeing and acting are separated by something deeper. A belief system built in childhood that says people are not their patterns. That love means seeing past behavior to the person beneath. That giving up on someone means giving up too soon. What makes this pattern so persistent is not a failure of perception. It's an achievement of it. People who give too many second chances often possess acute observational skills. They notice micro-expressions. They detect shifts in tone. They remember contradictions between what someone says and what someone does. Their awareness is not the problem. The problem is what happens after awareness, where the information goes, how it gets processed, what conclusions the mind draws from evidence that would, to most observers, be conclusive. The mind performs something subtle here. It separates the person from their behavior. It creates two categories: who they are and what they're currently doing. And once this separation exists, the behavior becomes temporary, circumstantial, fixable. The person underneath remains fundamentally good, fundamentally capable, fundamentally worth the investment. The harm becomes an expression of pain, stress, or unhealed wounds, rather than a choice being made repeatedly. This reframe provides relief, because if the harm is not the person, then the person can still change. If the pattern is just a phase, then patience is not wasted. If the behavior is driven by factors outside the person's core self, Then there's still hope that when those factors shift, the behavior will too. The mind would rather hold this hope than accept a simpler truth, that people show you who they are through their consistent choices, not through their occasional potential. There's also something else happening psychologically. When someone has already given multiple chances, a strange calculation begins. The brain starts measuring investment. All the time spent understanding this person, all the emotional energy spent forgiving, all the conversations spent explaining their behavior to others who suggested walking away, all of that becomes a form of currency, and the mind resists accepting that the currency has no value, that the investment will not yield return, that the chances given were not steps toward change but simply extensions of a pattern. This is not conscious. The person doesn't think, "I've invested too much to quit now," but the feeling operates beneath awareness, a sense that walking away would mean all those previous chances were wasted, that giving up now would retroactively make every earlier forgiveness pointless. So instead of seeing the pattern clearly, the mind adds another chance to the pile, hoping this one will be the one that finally justifies all the previous ones. Another psychological factor here is the way attention becomes selective. When someone is committed to believing in another person's potential, they start to hyper-focus on evidence that supports that belief. The person who is consistently late finally arrives on time, and that becomes proof of growth. The person who criticizes constantly offers one compliment, and that becomes evidence they're changing. The person who takes emotionally finally gives something small, and that gets magnified into significance. Meanwhile, the contradictory evidence gets minimized. The lateness returns, but this time there's traffic. The criticism resumes, but this time they're stressed. The taking continues, but this time they're going through something difficult. The mind becomes an attorney building a case for potential, while dismissing the evidence of pattern, not through deliberate deception, but through a genuine belief that focusing on the good will eventually amplify it into consistency. What's also true is that many people who give excessive second chances have built an identity around this behaviour. They see themselves as the person who doesn't give up on others, the one who sees beneath the surface, the one who understands that everyone has struggles and deserves compassion. This identity feels virtuous. It feels like strength. In a world that can be harsh and judgmental, being the person who believes in others feels like offering something valuable, something rare. But this identity comes with a cost that's not immediately obvious. Because when your sense of self becomes tied to giving chances, you lose the ability to withdraw them without feeling like you're losing yourself. Walking away starts to feel like betrayal, not just of the other person, but of your own values, of who you believe yourself to be. The mind resists this. It would rather continue the pattern than face the internal conflict of acting against identity. There's also a philosophical belief embedded here. Many people who do this carry a conviction that everyone is capable of change if given the right conditions. And that belief is not wrong. People are capable of change. But capability and willingness are not the same thing. Someone can have the capacity to grow and still choose not to. They can understand what needs to change and still decide the discomfort of changing is not worth it. They can see the harm they cause and still prioritize their own comfort over someone else's pain. The person giving chances often struggles to accept this distinction. They believe that if they create the right environment, provide enough support, demonstrate enough patience, the person will choose to use their capacity for change. But change doesn't work that way. Change happens when someone decides the cost of staying the same is too high. And when second chances keep arriving, when forgiveness is automatic, when consequences never materialize, there is no cost. There is only benefit. The person gets to keep behaving as they always have while retaining access to someone who continues to accommodate them. This dynamic creates something psychologists would recognize, but most people in the dynamic don't see clearly while they're in it. The person giving chances starts to feel responsible not just for their own choices but for the other person's growth. They internalize the belief that if change isn't happening, it's because they haven't been patient enough, understanding enough, or supportive enough. The responsibility shifts. The person causing harm is no longer accountable for change. The person giving chances becomes accountable for creating conditions where change becomes possible. This reversal is quiet but significant, because now the question is no longer why aren't they changing, but what am I not doing that would help them change? The focus moves from the person's choices to the giver's techniques, and this keeps the cycle active. Each failed chance is not evidence that the person won't change. It's evidence that the approach needs adjustment, that more understanding is required, that another chance, given differently, might finally work. There's another layer that often goes unexamined. Many people who give too many second chances are deeply uncomfortable with the idea of being the reason someone doesn't get an opportunity. They imagine themselves in the position of the person receiving chances, and they think about how much they would want someone to believe in them, how much it would hurt to be given up on, how unfair it would feel to be judged by mistakes rather than potential. This empathy is genuine, but it's also misdirected, because the person on the receiving end is not asking for chances to prove themselves. They're accepting chances without changing. And there's a difference between someone who wants an opportunity to grow and someone who wants continued access without consequences. What makes this pattern particularly difficult to interrupt is that it contains its own justification system. Every time someone questions the pattern, the mind supplies a defense. But people do change. True. But everyone deserves compassion. True. But I would want someone to be patient with me. True. None of these statements are false, but they're being applied to a situation where they don't fit. The person is not demonstrating effort toward change. They're demonstrating comfort with how things are, and the chances being given are not helping them grow. They're helping them stay the same. The mind also tends to focus on the apologies rather than the behavior. The person who causes harm may apologize sincerely. They may express genuine remorse. They may articulate clear understanding of what they did wrong. And for someone who gives too many second chances, these apologies feel like evidence, like proof that the person knows better and will do better. But apologies without behavioral change are just words. They're verbal patterns that maintain access without requiring transformation. And when someone apologizes repeatedly for the same behavior, they're not demonstrating awareness. They're demonstrating that consequences don't exist. From a psychological perspective, this connects to something fundamental about how the brain processes hope versus acceptance. Hope feels active. It feels like participation. It feels like maintaining control. Acceptance feels passive. It feels like surrender. It feels like admitting defeat. So when faced with the choice between hoping the person will change and accepting they're choosing not to, the brain often chooses hope, not because the evidence supports it, but because the feeling of hope is less painful than the feeling of acceptance. There's also a subtle form of control embedded in giving second chances. When someone continues to extend opportunities, they get to maintain a relationship on their terms. They get to feel needed. They get to occupy the position of understanding when others judge. They get to be the exception, the one person who still believes when everyone else has walked away. This position can feel meaningful. It can feel like love. But it's often closer to a need to be the person who makes a difference, a need to be irreplaceable, a need to prove that patience and faith can create change that consequence and distance cannot. The irony is that this approach often prevents the very thing it hopes to create. When someone never faces the consequences of their behaviour, when second chances arrive automatically, when forgiveness happens faster than reflection, there's no reason to change. The person is receiving what they want, which is continued access and relationship, without having to do the work of transformation. The giver of chances believes they're creating an environment for growth. What they're actually creating is an environment where growth is optional. Another important detail here is how this pattern affects the giver's internal emotional state. They begin to live in a constant state of monitoring, watching for signs of change, scanning for evidence that this chance is different from the previous ones, measuring progress in microscopic increments, tracking whether the person is trying and how much effort counts as enough. This vigilance is exhausting. It requires constant emotional energy to maintain hope against accumulating evidence. And over time, this exhaustion settles into the background of their life. They may not even realize how much energy they're spending on someone else's potential. Some people remember everything, every conversation, every look, every moment that felt wrong. They hold memories like evidence, replaying them again and again. But here's what makes it different. They remember what happened. They remember how it felt. But they never understood why it happened. And that gap between memory and a meaning becomes the space where everything gets distorted. You know the feeling. Someone said something years ago. You can still hear their tone. You can still see the expression on their face. You've replayed that moment so many times it's worn smooth like a stone you can't stop touching. But if someone asked you what they actually meant, what they were really trying to communicate, you realize something uncomfortable. You never asked. You never knew. You just recorded the hurt and carried it forward. This is different from normal memory. Most people remember experiences and naturally extract meaning from them. They process, they contextualize, they ask questions until things make sense. But some people skip that step entirely. They capture the emotional intensity with perfect clarity, while the comprehension remains frozen, unformed, locked in the moment it happened. And your body remembers. There's something specific about these memories. They don't fade the way other memories fade. They don't soften. They don't integrate into the story of your life as something that happened and then ended. They stay sharp. They stay present. They stay unresolved. Because resolution requires understanding, and understanding never came. They collect these moments. A comment from a parent that landed wrong. A look from a teacher that felt like judgment. A conversation with a friend where something shifted but you couldn't name what. A relationship that ended without explanation. A criticism at work that stung in a way you've never been able to articulate. Each moment preserved perfectly, each meaning absent. And you tell yourself you remember clearly. You tell yourself you know exactly what happened. You tell yourself the evidence is right there, recorded in your mind with documentary precision. But evidence of what? That something happened? Yes. That it hurt? Absolutely. That you understood it? That's where the certainty becomes something else, something more fragile, something built on feeling rather than comprehension. People who hold memories this way often describe a specific sensation. It's like carrying a box of puzzle pieces but never having seen the complete picture. Each piece feels significant, each piece feels important, but they don't know how the pieces fit together. They don't know what image they're supposed to form. So they just keep carrying the box, getting heavier with each new piece they add, never understanding that without the picture, the pieces are just fragments. The weight of these memories isn't just emotional, it's physical. It shows up in the tightness across your shoulders, in the tension in your jaw that you only notice when someone points it out, in the way your stomach clenches when something reminds you of one of those moments. Your body is holding what your mind couldn't process, storing it, keeping it active. Because unprocessed memory doesn't just sit quietly in the past, it lives in your nervous system, constantly ready to activate, constantly preparing you for a threat it never fully identified. This is different from trauma that's been processed. Processed trauma has a narrative. It has a beginning, middle, and end. It has meaning you've constructed through understanding. It's terrible, but it's complete. What you're carrying isn't complete. It's fragments. Moments frozen in confusion. Emotions preserved in amber. And because they're incomplete, they can't be filed away. They can't become part of your history. They remain part of your present, active and unresolved. Over time, these fragments start to feel like a complete picture. The gaps get filled not with understanding, but with assumptions. You decide what their silence meant. You interpret what their distance signified. You conclude what their words were really saying. And because you feel these interpretations so deeply, they transform from possibilities into certainties, from questions into answers, from confusion into conviction. This transformation happens gradually, subtly. You don't notice yourself making assumptions because they don't feel like assumptions. They feel like observations, like logical conclusions, like the only possible explanation for what happened. Your emotional intensity convinces you that you must be right, because if you feel something this strongly, it must be based on truth. But emotional intensity and factual accuracy are not the same thing. Sometimes they align, often they don't, and when they don't, you end up with certainty built on misunderstanding. The brain has a specific way of handling this. When you experience something emotionally intense, your amygdala activates, your stress hormones spike, your body goes into a state of heightened alertness, and in that state your brain prioritizes survival over comprehension. It records everything: the threat level, the sensory details, the emotional tone. But the part of your brain that makes sense of things, that analyzes and contextualizes and seeks understanding, that part gets quieter. Because in a moment of perceived threat, understanding is secondary to survival. So you walk away with a perfect recording of a moment you never actually understood. And because the recording is so vivid, because you can replay it with such clarity, you assume you comprehend it. But memory and meaning are not the same thing. You can remember everything and understand nothing. This creates a specific kind of confusion. You're certain about what happened. You can describe it in detail, but you're uncertain about what it meant, and that uncertainty is intolerable. So your brain does something automatic. It fills the gap. It creates a story that makes the memory make sense. And once that story is created, once it's been rehearsed a few times, it stops feeling like a story. It starts feeling like fact. This is what creates the gap. You remember they looked angry, but you never asked why. You remember they said something that felt dismissive, but you never clarified what they actually meant. You remember feeling small in that moment, but you never discovered whether that was their intention or your interpretation. The emotional truth, the feeling, that stays sharp and clear. The factual truth, the actual meaning behind their words and actions, that remains unknown. And here's what makes this pattern so persistent. The brain doesn't like gaps. It doesn't like uncertainty. It doesn't like carrying unresolved questions. So it does something automatic, something you don't even notice happening. It fills the gaps, not with understanding, with assumptions, with narratives, with conclusions that feel true, because they match the emotional intensity of the memory. They looked angry, so you decide they were angry at you. They seemed distant, so you conclude they didn't care. They said something you didn't understand, so you interpret it as criticism. And because these interpretations arrive quickly, automatically, wrapped in the same emotional intensity as the original moment, they don't feel like assumptions, they feel like observations, like facts, like truth. The problem is this: once an assumption crystallizes into certainty, it becomes nearly impossible to question. You rehearse it, you replay it, you tell the story to yourself and sometimes to others, and every rehearsal reinforces the neural pathway. Every retelling makes it more solid. What started as confusion, as a moment you didn't fully comprehend, becomes a defining memory, a piece of evidence, proof of something that may never have been true. What's fascinating and tragic about this process is how it mirrors the very confusion it's trying to resolve. You're confused about what someone meant, so you create a story about what they meant. But that story is just another layer of confusion disguised as clarity. You haven't resolved the original confusion, you've just covered it with interpretation, and now you're defending the interpretation as if it were the original experience. People who hold memories this way often have a specific experience that they can't quite name. They feel certain about what happened. They can describe it in detail. They can tell you exactly what was said and how it felt. But if you press them, if you ask them to explain the other person's perspective, their motivation, their context, something shifts. The certainty wavers. Because they never actually understood. They only ever interpreted. An interpretation without inquiry is just guessing dressed up as knowledge. This becomes particularly complicated when the memories involve people they love, because questioning the memory feels like betraying the relationship. If you loved someone and they hurt you, that hurt becomes sacred. It becomes proof of your loyalty, your sensitivity, your ability to feel deeply. Questioning whether you understood the hurt correctly feels like minimizing it, like saying it didn't matter. Like giving the other person permission to hurt you again, but questioning your interpretation isn't minimizing your pain, it's seeking accuracy. And accuracy is what allows actual healing. Because you can't heal from something you don't understand, you can only carry it, rehearse it, let it shape you in ways you don't choose. And that's not healing, that's being haunted by fragments that were never given meaning. What's happening psychologically is a confusion between emotional truth and factual truth. The emotional truth is real. You felt dismissed, you felt hurt, you felt uncertain or afraid or angry. Those feelings are valid, genuine, documented in your nervous system. But emotional truth doesn't automatically reveal factual truth. Feeling dismissed doesn't mean someone intended to dismiss you. Feeling hurt doesn't mean someone intended to hurt you. Feeling confused doesn't mean someone was deliberately confusing. This distinction is crucial because when you conflate the two, when you assume your emotional experience is an accurate read of someone else's intention, you create a reality that might not exist. And then you respond to that reality. You protect yourself from it. You build defenses against it. You treat people as if they intended harm when they might have been utterly unaware they caused any. And this creates a tragic pattern. The more intensely you feel something, the more certain you become about what caused it. But intense feeling often means you are too activated to think clearly in that moment, too overwhelmed to ask questions, too dysregulated to seek understanding. So the moments that hurt the most become the moments you understand the least, and those are exactly the memories you hold most tightly. Your most painful memories are often your least accurate ones, not because the pain wasn't real, but because pain impairs comprehension. When you're in acute emotional distress, your brain isn't designed to analyze and contextualize. It's designed to survive. So it records the threat, it captures the danger signals, but it doesn't capture the full context. It doesn't capture the other person's stress or limitations or struggles. It doesn't capture that their behavior might have had nothing to do with you. It just captures, this hurt, remember this, avoid this in the future. Over time, you build an entire internal world based on these fragments. A collection of moments you remember with perfect emotional clarity and zero actual comprehension. And this collection starts to feel like a story. The story of who hurt you, the story of why you struggle, the story of what's wrong with other people. But it's not actually a story. It's a collection of emotional snapshots with narrative bridges you built yourself. Bridges made of assumption, not understanding. The architecture of this internal world is elaborate. You have categories, types of people who hurt you, types of situations that are dangerous, types of comments that mean rejection, and every new experience gets sorted into these categories. Someone does something that reminds you of one of your fragments, and immediately they get filed into the corresponding category. You know who they are, what they'll do, how they'll hurt you, not because they've actually done it yet, but because they remind you of someone in your archive who did something you interpreted as similar. This is how fragments become filters. You're not seeing new people and new situations clearly. You're seeing them through the lens of old misunderstandings, and that lens distorts everything. It makes neutral things look threatening. It makes different things look the same. It makes the present look like the past, and you respond accordingly. You protect yourself from dangers that aren't there. You create distance from people who weren't actually moving away. You defend against attacks that weren't being launched. The real danger here is that these memories don't just sit passively in your mind. They shape your present. They filter new experiences through old misunderstandings. Someone gives you feedback now, and it triggers the memory of criticism you never understood then. Someone sets a boundary now, and it activates the feeling of rejection you misinterpreted before. Someone seems distant now, and it confirms the pattern of abandonment you assumed existed. You start seeing evidence everywhere, not because the pattern is actually repeating, but because you're looking for confirmation of something you never verified to begin with. And human perception is designed to find what it's looking for. If you believe people dismiss you, you'll notice every moment that could possibly be interpreted as dismissal, while missing all the moments of genuine engagement. If you believe you're always misunderstood, you'll collect examples of confusion while ignoring all the times you were seen clearly. This selective attention is automatic. You're not consciously choosing to focus on the negative, but your brain is wired to prioritize threat detection, and once you've identified something as a threat based on your fragments, your brain stays alert for that threat. It watches for it. It anticipates it. And when you're watching for something, you almost always find it, even when it's not there, even when you have to twist neutral data to make it fit the pattern. Someone is quiet. They could be tired. They could be processing something internal. They could be comfortable in silence. But you don't consider those options. You go straight to, they're upset with me. They're pulling away. This is like that time with that other person who got quiet before they left. And suddenly their silence isn't just silence. It's evidence. Proof that the pattern is repeating. Confirmation that your fragments were accurate all along. But you never check. You never ask, are you upset? Or, is everything okay? Because asking feels vulnerable. It feels like revealing that you're confused. And confusion feels dangerous, so instead, you interpret. You conclude. You add this new moment to your collection, and the collection grows heavier. This is why these memories don't fade. They can't be processed. They can't be understood. They can only be rehearsed, and every rehearsal makes them feel more true, more solid, more central to your identity. What started as a confusing moment becomes a defining trauma. What started as something you didn't understand becomes something you're absolutely certain about. The neuroscience of this is revealing. Every time you recall a memory, you're not just accessing stored information, you're reconstructing it. And during reconstruction, the memory is vulnerable to change. Details can shift, emotions can intensify, interpretations can solidify. So each time you replay a memory without new understanding, you're actually reinforcing your interpretation as if it were fact. You're essentially rewriting the memory to match your assumption. And after enough rehearsals, the original experience and your interpretation of it become indistinguishable. This is why people can be so certain about things that never happened the way they remember. They're not lying, they're not intentionally distorting, they genuinely remember it that way. Because that's how they've reconstructed it over hundreds of rehearsals. The memory has been shaped by their interpretation, until the interpretation is the memory. But certainty built on misunderstanding isn't strength. It's fragility pretending to be conviction. And the more you defend it, the more trapped you become in a past that was never accurately recorded to begin with. At some point in their life, usually very early on, they learn to record without understanding, to feel everything and comprehend nothing. Not because they weren't smart enough, but because no one taught them how to translate emotion into meaning. Children experience the world in fragments. They don't have the cognitive development to understand adult complexity. They don't have the emotional vocabulary to name what they're feeling. They don't have the life experience to contextualize what's happening around them. So when intense things happen, when parents fight or withdraw or explode or disappear, children record the intensity without the comprehension. They remember everything and understand nothing. A parent slams a door. The child feels the vibration in their chest. They see the anger on the parent's face. They hear the sharpness in their voice. And they conclude something, not through reasoning, through feeling. They conclude they did something wrong. They conclude they're not safe. They conclude love is conditional and can be withdrawn at any moment. But they never understand what was actually happening, that their parent was overwhelmed, that the anger had nothing to do with them, that adults sometimes lose control of their emotions without it meaning anything about the child's worth. What makes this particularly damaging is that children are egocentric by developmental necessity. They don't have the cognitive capacity to understand that other people have separate inner lives, separate struggles, separate contexts. So when something goes wrong in their environment, they naturally conclude it must be about them. They must have caused it. They must be responsible for it. This isn't a character flaw. It's a developmental reality. Children can't think any other way yet, so every parental argument becomes evidence that the child is bad. Every stressed out moment becomes proof that the child is too much. Every time a parent is unavailable becomes confirmation that the child isn't worth time and attention. The child doesn't understand that parents fight about money or extended family or stress at work. They don't understand that parents withdraw when they're depressed or overwhelmed. They don't understand that parental unavailability is about parental limitations, not about child value. They carry that, fragment forward. That moment of intensity without comprehension, and it becomes a template, a way of experiencing the world. Record the feeling, skip the understanding, build a conclusion, move forward, repeat. This is how the pattern forms, not through a single traumatic event, though those certainly reinforce it, through hundreds of small moments where emotion was present and explanation was absent, where something intense happened and no one helped them make sense of it, where they were left alone with feelings they couldn't name and experiences they couldn't decode. A mother goes quiet for days. The child notices. The child feels the shift. The child experiences the absence. But no one explains that mother is depressed. No one says the silence has nothing to do with the child's value. No one translates the adult struggle into child-appropriate understanding, so the child fills the gap. They decide they said something wrong. They conclude they're too much or not enough. They interpret silence as rejection, and that interpretation, formed in the absence of information, becomes the truth they carry. And here's the particularly cruel part. Often the silence isn't even about depression. Sometimes the mother is quiet because she's processing her own trauma. Sometimes she's quiet because she learned from her own mother that silent suffering is how women cope. Sometimes she's quiet because she's so overwhelmed she can't find words. But the child doesn't know any of that. The child just knows. Mother is here, but not here. Mother is present but absent. And that must mean something about me. A father criticizes. The words are sharp. The tone is harsh. The child feels small. But the child never understands that father is repeating the only parenting he knows. That father is projecting his own unmet needs onto his child. That the criticism says everything about father's pain and nothing about child's inadequacy. The child just records the harshness, remembers the feeling of being insufficient, carries it forward as evidence of their unworthiness. The criticism often comes from father's own wounds. He was criticized by his father. He learned that love comes with conditions. He learned that acceptance requires performance. He learned that nothing is ever good enough. And now he's passing that down, not because he wants to hurt his child, but because he literally doesn't know another way to parent. He thinks he's helping. He thinks he's preparing his child for a harsh world. He thinks high standards equal high love. But the child doesn't understand the father's history. They don't understand the father's wounds. They don't understand that the criticism is about the father's anxiety, not about the child's inadequacy. They just feel the sting. They hear not good enough and internalize it as I am not good enough. And that internalization becomes foundational. It becomes the lens through which they see themselves for decades. a sibling gets more attention. The child notices. The child keeps score. The child builds a narrative about favoritism, but they never understand that the sibling was struggling, that parents were responding to crisis, not preference. That attention distributed unequally doesn't mean love distributed unequally. They just remember feeling less important. And they decide that memory means they were less important. The feeling becomes the fact. This sibling dynamic is particularly powerful because it creates a comparison framework that lasts a lifetime. The child who got less attention doesn't just conclude they were less important in that family. They conclude they're less important, period. They carry that into friendships, into romantic relationships, into workplaces. They're always watching to see who gets more, who gets chosen, who gets priority, and they're always expecting to come up short. Because that's what they learned, that's what they remember, even though they never understood that their sibling got more attention because their sibling had a learning disability, or was being bullied at school, or was showing signs of mental health struggles that required intervention. This is the tragedy of childhood emotional experiences without adult guidance. Children don't naturally ask for context. They don't think to say, "Can you explain what's happening and why?" They just absorb. They just feel. They just conclude. And those conclusions, formed in the absence of cognitive sophistication, become the foundation for adult patterns. What makes this even more damaging is that children often blame themselves for things that have nothing to do with them. When a parent is angry, the child assumes they caused it. When a parent withdraws, the child believes they deserve it. When a parent leaves, the child concludes they weren't worth staying for. This is how a child's mind protects itself. If I caused the problem, maybe I can fix it. If I deserve this treatment, then the world makes sense. It's a devastating logic, but it's logic nonetheless. Better to believe you're bad than to believe you're powerless. Self-blame is actually a survival strategy in childhood, because if the problem is you, then you have some control. You can try to be better. You can try to be different. You can try to earn the love and safety you need. But if the problem is the parent, if the parent is simply incapable or unavailable or struggling, then you have no control. You're completely at the mercy of someone who can't meet your needs, and that's too terrifying for a child to accept. So they make themselves the problem. They take on the blame. They carry the shame. Because shame is more tolerable than helplessness. And no one corrects these conclusions. No one sits the child down and says, "That wasn't about you. Let me explain what was really happening." No one offers the context that would transform a confusing fragment into an understandable story, so the fragment stays frozen, preserved exactly as it was experienced. Intense feeling, zero comprehension, perfect confusion. The absence of explanation is itself a form of harm, not intentional harm usually. Most parents aren't deliberately withholding context to hurt their children. They're just overwhelmed, or don't know how to explain adult problems to children, or genuinely believe that children are better off not knowing about parental struggles. But that silence, that absence of explanation, creates a void, and children fill voids with whatever makes sense to them in their limited understanding, which is almost always self-blame. Over time, these fragments accumulate, dozens of them, hundreds of them, each one a moment of emotional intensity without cognitive understanding, each one a memory that was recorded but never processed, and they don't stay isolated, they start to form a pattern, a way of seeing the world, a way of interpreting experience. The child learns that emotion is information, that feeling bad means something bad is happening. That feeling scared means they're in danger. That feeling rejected means they're being rejected. They never learn that feelings can be inaccurate, that emotions can be responses to misunderstanding, that their nervous system can activate without it meaning anything about reality. This emotional reasoning becomes their primary way of knowing. If I feel it, it must be true. If I'm afraid, there must be danger. If I'm hurt, someone must have hurt me. They never develop the capacity to step back and question their feelings, to ask whether the feeling matches the facts, to consider alternative explanations, because no one taught them that feelings and facts are different things that sometimes align and sometimes don't. They also learn that understanding is optional, that you don't need to ask questions, that you don't need to seek clarity, that you can just feel something intensely and know it's true. Because in childhood, when no one was offering explanations anyway, asking questions didn't help. So they stopped asking. They stopped seeking understanding. They just started recording and concluding, over and over until it became automatic. This is the operating system they develop. Experience emotion, record moment, skip comprehension, form conclusion, store as fact, move forward. This process happens in seconds. It's automatic, unconscious. They don't even know they're doing it. They just know that some moments hurt and they remember them clearly, and those memories tell them important things about themselves and other people and the world. By the time they reach adulthood, this pattern is so deeply ingrained they don't even recognize it as a pattern. It's just how memory works. It's just how they process experience. Something happens. They feel something. They conclude something. They move forward. The idea of pausing to ask what someone actually meant, what they were truly trying to communicate, what context they were operating from, that idea never even occurs to them, because it never occurred to anyone to teach them, and that pattern doesn't disappear in adulthood. It simply becomes more subtle. They keep recording, they keep holding, they keep feeling, but they never learn to ask the one question that changes everything. What was this really about? The transition from childhood to adulthood doesn't resolve this pattern. If anything, it intensifies it. Because now they have years of accumulated fragments, a massive internal archive of moments they've misunderstood, and every new experience gets filtered through that archive. Every new person gets compared to people in their past. Every new interaction gets sorted into categories built from old confusion. So as adults, they walk through relationships carrying fragments, pieces of conversations, moments of tension, looks that felt loaded, all recorded with perfect clarity, all misunderstood with perfect certainty. As adults, these individuals often appear sensitive, careful. They remember small details. They recall things you said months ago. They notice shifts in tone you thought were invisible. But what looks like attentiveness is often something else. They're not listening for understanding, they're scanning for threat. Their childhood taught them that danger doesn't announce itself clearly. It shows up in a parent's tone, in a subtle shift of energy, in words that feel slightly off. So they learn to monitor everything, to track every micro-expression, to catalogue every tonal variation, not to understand, to survive. This hypervigilance is exhausting for them and for everyone around them, because they're processing every interaction at multiple levels. What was said, how it was said, what it might mean, what it reminds them of, what pattern it might be part of, and they're doing this constantly, unconsciously, automatically. It's not a choice. It's a survival mechanism that never got turned off. The problem is that hypervigilance finds threats everywhere. When you're looking for danger in every interaction, you'll find it. A slight change in someone's tone becomes evidence they're upset. A momentary distraction becomes proof they're losing interest. A neutral comment becomes loaded with hidden meaning, because that's what your system is designed to do. It's designed to find the threat before the threat finds you. This hypervigilance follows them into every relationship, every friendship, every workplace, every interaction. They're reading the room constantly, watching for signs, collecting data. But they're not collecting data to build understanding. They're collecting data to confirm threat, to identify danger before it fully emerges, to protect themselves from being blindsided again. And here's what makes this so exhausting for everyone involved. They remember things you don't remember. They bring up comments you made casually that meant nothing to you, that you've completely forgotten. And they present these comments as evidence, proof of your pattern, documentation of your character. But they're not actually evidence of anything except their own hypervigilance and misinterpretation. You said something neutral. They heard criticism. You set a boundary. They experienced rejection. You had a bad day and were short. They concluded you don't respect them. And they remember their interpretation with absolute clarity. They can quote you back to yourself. They can describe the moment in detail. They can tell you exactly how it felt, but they can't tell you what you actually meant, because they never asked. The discrepancy between what you said and what they heard can be startling. You say, "I need some time alone tonight." They hear, "I don't want to be around you." You say, "Can we talk about this later?" They hear, "Your feelings don't matter." You say, "I'm not sure about that." They hear, "You're wrong and I don't trust your judgment." The gap between your words and their interpretation is vast, but they don't experience it as interpretation. They experience it as truth, as what you really meant beneath what you actually said. This is where the pattern becomes truly damaging. They build cases against people, dossiers of evidence, collections of moments that felt wrong. And they present these cases as objective reality. But objective reality requires more than one perspective. It requires understanding intention, not just impact. It requires knowing what someone meant, not just how their words landed. They don't have that. They have fragments, emotional snapshots, memories preserved in feeling but not in meaning. And they've arranged these fragments into a narrative, a story about who you are, what you've done, how you've hurt them. But the story was written in the absence of understanding, so it's not actually your story. It's their interpretation, their assumption, their conclusion based on incomplete data. Building a case feels protective. It feels like gathering proof, like making sure you're not crazy, like validating that your pain is real. But what it actually does is lock you into an interpretation that was never checked. Every new piece of evidence just reinforces a conclusion you reached without understanding. You're not building an accurate picture. You're building a confirmation bias structure. And the more you build, the harder it becomes to question the foundation. And when you try to explain, when you offer context, when you say that's not what I meant, they don't hear clarification. They hear denial. Because in their world, their memory is perfect. Their emotional experience is evidence. Their interpretation is fact. The idea that they might have misunderstood doesn't compute, because understanding was never part of the process to begin with. To them, your explanation sounds like gaslighting, You're telling them their memory is wrong. Their feelings are invalid. Their experience didn't happen. They don't understand that you're not denying their feelings. You're offering context for their feelings. You're explaining what you actually meant versus what they concluded you meant. But that distinction is invisible to them because they've conflated feeling and fact so thoroughly that questioning one feels like denying both. This creates an impossible dynamic. You're constantly defending yourself against accusations based on misremembered intentions. They're constantly hurt by things you never actually said or meant. You feel perpetually misunderstood. They feel perpetually attacked. And neither of you realizes that you're not having the same conversation. You're trying to explain what you meant. They're trying to make you acknowledge what they felt. But meaning and feeling are not the same thing. The conversations go in circles. You explain your intention. They describe their pain. You clarify your words. They quote their memory. You offer context. They present evidence. You ask for understanding. They demand acknowledgement. And nothing moves. Because you're speaking different languages. You're speaking the language of intention and context. They're speaking the language of emotional truth and historical pattern. And those languages don't translate. What's happening is they're experiencing every interaction through the filter of every unprocessed fragment they've ever carried. You remind them of someone. Your tone triggers an old memory. Your words activate a childhood wound. And suddenly you're not just you. You're every person who ever hurt them. Every moment that never made sense. Every confusion that crystallized into certainty. They don't see you clearly. They see you through layers of misunderstood past. And they don't realize they're doing it. It feels like they're responding to you, to what you're actually saying and doing. But they're responding to ghosts, to fragments, to memories that were never accurately understood to begin with. This phenomenon is called transference in psychology. But it's more specific than that. It's not just transferring feelings from one person to another. It's transferring entire interpretive frameworks, entire narrative structures, entire collections of misunderstood moments, and applying them to someone who has nothing to do with those original moments. You're being held responsible for a past you didn't create and a meaning you never intended. The most painful part of this for you is that you can't win. Nothing you say or do will change their interpretation, because their interpretation isn't based on you. It's based on their archive, their fragments, their unprocessed past. You could be perfect, and they'd still find evidence of your pattern. Because the pattern isn't yours, it's theirs. It's how they process experience, how they organize reality, how they make sense of confusion by imposing familiar narratives on unfamiliar situations. This is why they can't let things go. You apologize, they say they forgive, but the memory stays active. It comes up again and again. Because forgiveness requires understanding, release requires processing, and they never understood the thing to begin with, so they can't process it, so they can't release it. They can only rehearse it, again and again and again. True forgiveness requires metabolizing the hurt, taking it in, breaking it down, understanding its components, and integrating it into your story in a way that allows you to move forward. But you can't metabolize what you never fully ingested. You can't break down what you never properly examined. You can't integrate what you never understood. So the hurt just stays there, raw, unprocessed, active, waiting to be triggered again. And over time they become curators of pain. Not because they want to suffer, but because they have no other way to make sense of what they've carried. The fragments become their story, and the story becomes their identity. They are the person who was misunderstood, the person who was hurt, the person who remembers everything everyone else conveniently forgets. But what they're remembering isn't actually what happened. It's what they decided happened in the absence of understanding. This identity built on misunderstood fragments becomes rigid, because if you've spent decades building your sense of self around being the hurt one, the misunderstood one, the one who remembers what others forget, then letting go of those fragments feels like losing yourself. Who are you if you're not the person carrying all this pain? Who are you if your memories aren't accurate? Who are you if you've been wrong about what hurt you? Those questions are too destabilizing. So the fragments stay, the identity remains, the pain continues. The tragedy here is double. They're trapped in a past that was never accurately recorded, and they're destroying present relationships by filtering them through that inaccurate past. They're not choosing this. They're operating from the only template they have, the template that says, record the feeling, skip the understanding, build the conclusion, hold it forever. And that template doesn't just affect romantic relationships, it affects every connection they try to build, every friendship, every family relationship, every professional interaction. They bring their archive with them everywhere. And everyone they meet gets filtered through that archive, gets compared to those fragments, gets sorted into categories that were built from misunderstanding. Over time, these patterns don't stay confined to memory. They begin to shape relationships in ways that feel inevitable, but are actually chosen, unconsciously, again and again. In close relationships, people who hold memories without understanding create a specific kind of distance, not the distance of absence, the distance of constant misinterpretation. You're always explaining, they're always remembering, but somehow you never meet in the middle. You say something simple, something you've said 100 times without issue, but this time, something about your tone, your timing, your facial expression triggers one of their fragments, and suddenly you're not having a conversation about what you just said. You're having a conversation about what they decided you meant, about what this reminds them of, about the pattern they believe you're repeating, and you're confused because you meant nothing complicated. You were tired or distracted or thinking about something else entirely. Your words were literal. Your intention was transparent. But they heard something else. They felt something else. And what they felt becomes more real to them than what you actually said. So you explain, you clarify, you offer context, and they nod. They say they understand, but you can see it in their eyes. They're not really hearing you. They're still holding on to their version, their interpretation, their emotional truth, and your explanation just becomes another thing they'll misremember later, another piece of evidence that you don't take responsibility, that you always make excuses, that you gaslight them by denying their reality. This is the exhausting cycle. You say something. They interpret it through their filter of unprocessed memories. You clarify what you meant. They experience your clarification as dismissal of their feelings. You get frustrated because you're constantly misunderstood. They get hurt because you're constantly denying their experience. And neither of you realizes that you're living in two completely different versions of the same relationship. In their version, you're always saying things that hurt. You're always being dismissive or critical or distant. You're always repeating the same patterns, and they have evidence. Moments they remember clearly. Things you said, things you did, Proof of who you really are beneath whatever you're claiming now. In your version, you're trying. You're communicating as clearly as you know how. You're offering explanations and context. But nothing lands. Nothing gets through. Everything gets twisted into something you didn't mean. And you start to feel crazy. Like you can't trust your own words. Like anything you say will be used against you later in a form you won't recognize. The feeling of going crazy is specific. It's the feeling of your reality being constantly undermined, of your clear communication being translated into something unrecognizable, of your good intentions being interpreted as manipulation, of your genuine care being received as subtle cruelty. You start questioning yourself. Did I really say that? Did I mean something I wasn't aware of? Am I actually the problem here? And that self-doubt is corrosive, because it makes you uncertain about your own perceptions, your own truth, your own intentions. What's actually happening is they're not responding to you. They're responding to their archive, their collection of misunderstood moments. And every new interaction gets sorted into that archive, compared against old fragments, interpreted through old conclusions. You're not a person having a conversation with them. You're a data point being processed through a system that was built without understanding. And the most painful part is that their pain is real. When they say you hurt them, they're not lying. They genuinely feel hurt. The feeling is authentic, valid, present. But the cause they're attributing it to is often inaccurate. You didn't hurt them with what you said. They hurt themselves with what they decided you meant. But they can't distinguish between those two things. To them, there is no distinction. Their feeling is the evidence. Their interpretation is the fact. This creates something that relationship therapists call a negative sentiment override. Once someone has collected enough fragments, enough misunderstood moments, enough evidence of hurt, they start interpreting everything through that lens. Neutral becomes negative. Positive becomes suspicious. Clear becomes coded. You can't do anything right because everything you do gets filtered through their archive of everything they believe you've done wrong. You smile. They wonder what you're hiding. You're quiet. They assume you're angry. You're engaged. They think you're being fake. You're distant. They know you're pulling away. There's no winning. Because they're not actually seeing you. They're seeing their collection of misunderstood memories, and that collection has already convicted you. Negative sentiment override means that your positive actions don't register as positive. They register as suspicious. If you do something nice, they wonder what you want. If you're affectionate, they think you're trying to manipulate them. If you apologize, they believe you're just trying to avoid consequences. Every good thing you do gets reinterpreted through their negative framework until it becomes evidence of something bad. And here's what makes this so painful for both people. They genuinely believe they're being clear. They're telling you what's wrong. They're showing you the evidence. They're giving you examples. And they can't understand why you keep denying it. Why you keep playing dumb. Why you keep making them explain. But you're not playing dumb. You genuinely don't recognize the version of yourself they're describing. The things they say you said. The tone they claim you used. The pattern they insist you're repeating. Because you didn't say those things. You didn't mean what they think you meant. You're not repeating a pattern. They are. They're repeating the pattern of misunderstanding and then defending their misunderstanding as truth. So you're both suffering. They feel unheard, invalidated, hurt by someone who won't acknowledge the harm. You feel misunderstood, misrepresented, attacked for things you didn't do. And the relationship becomes a space where both people are in pain and no one can find the exit. Because the exit would require something neither person knows how to do. It would require them to question their certainty, to ask, is it possible I misunderstood? To seek understanding rather than defending their interpretation. But they can't do that. Their entire sense of reality is built on those fragments, those memories, those conclusions. Questioning them feels like losing their grip on truth itself. And what makes this even more complicated is that sometimes they're right. Sometimes you did say something dismissive. Sometimes you were being short or critical or distant. Sometimes their fragment accurately captured your mistake. But even when they're right about what happened, they're still missing the understanding. They remember you were short. They don't understand you were overwhelmed. They remember you were critical. They don't know you are projecting your own stress. They remember you were distant. They don't realize you needed space to process. So even their accurate memories are incomplete. They have half the story, the half that hurt them, but not the half that explains why. And without both halves, they can't process it. They can't integrate it. They can only hold it as evidence of your wrongness, your pattern, your character. Context changes everything. But they don't have context. They have impact, and impact without context creates a distorted narrative. You were short because you just got devastating news, but they don't know that. They just know you were short. You were critical because you're terrified of failure and projecting that onto others, but they don't understand that. They just know you were critical. You were distant because you're processing trauma and need solitude, but they can't see that. They just know you were distant. And without the why, the what becomes a character judgment. You're not someone who was short in a difficult moment. You're someone who is short. You're not someone who was critical while struggling. You're someone who is critical. You're not someone who needed distance. You're someone who withdraws. The behavior becomes the identity. The moment becomes the pattern. The fragment becomes the truth. This is why these relationships often end. Not with a dramatic fight, with slow erosion. You get tired of explaining. They get tired of being hurt. You start withdrawing to avoid being misunderstood. They start collecting evidence of your withdrawal. You create distance to protect yourself. They interpret distance as abandonment. And the pattern that started with misunderstood fragments ends with an actually broken connection. The ending often feels inevitable to both people. You feel like you tried everything and nothing worked. They feel like they gave you every chance and you never changed. But what actually happened is that you were in two different relationships. You were in a relationship with them as they actually are. They were in a relationship with you as their fragments told them you are. And those two relationships never overlapped enough to create real connection. And what makes this so tragic is that both people are suffering. One person feels perpetually attacked by a past they don't recognize. The other feels perpetually abandoned in a pain no one validates, because they're not arguing about what happened. They're living in two completely different versions of the same story. When the relationship ends, both people often carry the same confusion forward. You carry confusion about why you could never get through to them. They carry confusion about why no one ever really sees their pain. And both of you enter new relationships with these confusions intact, ready to repeat the pattern. Because neither of you understood what was actually happening. You just know it hurt. You just know it failed. You just know relationships are hard in ways you can't quite articulate. In work environments, this pattern creates a different, kind of damage, more subtle, more professional, but just as corrosive. At work, people who can't forget what they never understood often appear conscientious, detail-oriented. They remember every meeting, every email, every comment. But underneath that surface, something else is happening. They're building cases, collecting evidence, preparing for battles that haven't been declared. A manager gives feedback on a project. Standard feedback, constructive, specific. The kind of feedback that's meant to improve work, not attack character. But they don't hear it that way. They hear criticism, they hear disappointment, they hear evidence that they're not good enough, and they remember it, not the actual words, not the intention behind the feedback, just the feeling, the shame, the sense of being evaluated and found lacking. Months later, that manager asks them to revise something else, a completely different project, completely different circumstances, and they bring up the previous feedback. Like last time when you said my work wasn't good enough. But the manager never said that. The manager said the work needed revision. That's not the same thing. But in their memory, in their archive, those two statements are identical. Because they never understood the difference, they only felt the similarity. Workplace feedback is particularly vulnerable to this pattern because it's inherently evaluative. Someone in authority is assessing your work, and if you're someone who already carries fragments about not being good enough, every piece of feedback, no matter how constructive, lands like confirmation. See, I was right. I'm not good enough. They see it too. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is normal professional development. Someone is helping you improve. Someone is investing time in making you better at what you do. But you can't receive it that way because your filter doesn't allow for that interpretation. Your filter says evaluation equals judgment. Judgment equals rejection. Rejection equals confirmation that you've always been inadequate. They remember a coworker declined to have lunch with them once, maybe twice. The coworker was busy, had other plans, was trying to meet a deadline, normal workplace dynamics. But they don't see it that way. They see exclusion. They see evidence of not belonging. They see proof that this coworker doesn't like them. And they remember every single time. They keep score. They build a narrative. So-and-so has been excluding me since March, but so-and-so hasn't been excluding them. So-and-so has been having lunch with different people on different days for different reasons that have nothing to do with them. But they never asked. They never sought understanding. They just felt excluded and concluded exclusion. And that conclusion is now a fact in their internal archive. The scorekeeping is exhausting for everyone. Because social connection becomes transactional, lunch invitations become evidence of worth. Not being included becomes proof of rejection. Every social interaction gets tallied, gets measured, gets compared, and the person keeping score doesn't realise that most people aren't keeping score at all. Most people are just navigating their day, making spontaneous decisions, responding to immediate needs, not carefully curating who gets included and who gets excluded. In meetings, someone makes a joke. The room laughs. They laugh too in the moment, but later they start replaying it. Was that joke about them? Was that comment directed at them? Were people laughing at them? And the more they replay it, the more certain they become. Yes, that was about them. That was mocking. That was evidence of disrespect. Even though it wasn't. Even though no one was thinking about them at all. The joke was just a joke. The laughter was just laughter. But they've transformed it into something else entirely. This post-interaction analysis is a hallmark of the pattern. They can't just experience a moment and move on. They have to analyze it, dissect it, figure out what it meant. And because they're analyzing without checking, without asking, without seeking actual information, they always arrive at the worst possible interpretation. Because that's what their filter allows. That's what their fragments have trained them to see. This is how workplace relationships become tense. Their co-workers start to notice. Everything has to be said carefully around this person. Jokes are dangerous. Feedback requires excessive softening. Casual comments might be remembered and brought up later as evidence of something that never happened. So people start walking on eggshells, start maintaining distance, start being more formal and less authentic, and the person collecting fragments interprets this distance as proof. See? People are cold. People are excluding them. People are treating them differently. They're not wrong about the different treatment, but they're wrong about the cause. People aren't treating them differently because they don't like them. People are treating them differently because every interaction feels like a potential minefield. Because anything said might be misremembered and weaponized later. The minefield metaphor is accurate. People feel like they're carefully stepping around hidden explosives. They don't know what will trigger a reaction. They don't know what casual comment will be added to the case being built against them. They don't know what normal interaction will later be presented as evidence of a pattern, so they become careful, measured, distant, which is exactly what the fragment collector fears and exactly what their behavior creates. This creates a feedback loop. Their hypervigilance to being hurt makes others careful. Others being careful feels like coldness. Coldness confirms their belief that they're not wanted, so they become more vigilant, more careful themselves, more likely to interpret neutral interactions as negative. And the cycle tightens. In performance reviews, they hear things the reviewer didn't say. You said I'm not a team player. No, the reviewer said there's room for growth and collaboration. You said my work is consistently poor. No, the reviewer said there were a few projects that didn't meet expectations. But they don't hear the nuance. They don't hear the actual words. They hear their interpretation, their emotional truth, and they remember that as what was said. So they walk out of the review feeling attacked, devastated, certain they're about to be fired, even though the review was actually positive overall with a few areas for development. But they didn't hear the positive. They filtered it out. They only recorded the parts that felt like criticism, and those parts grew in their memory until they consumed everything else. The cognitive distortion here is called filtering. They're screening out the positive and amplifying the negative, but they don't experience it as distortion. They experience it as finally hearing the truth beneath the polite language. They think they're seeing through the facade. They think they're reading between the lines. They think they're hearing what the reviewer really meant but was too professional to say directly. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is their filter is doing what filters do. It's letting through what matches expectations and blocking what doesn't. This is why HR gets involved, because they file complaints about things that didn't happen, about patterns of discrimination or harassment or targeting that exist only in their collection of misunderstood fragments. They have examples, they have dates, they have quotes. But the quotes are inaccurate, the examples are misinterpreted. The pattern is something they constructed, not something that exists. And this puts everyone in an impossible position. Their distress is real, their feelings of being targeted are genuine, but the targeting isn't actually happening. So how do you respond? How do you validate someone's pain while also making clear that their interpretation of events is inaccurate? Most workplaces don't know how, so they just try to smooth things over, move the person to a different team, avoid direct feedback, try to minimize conflict, but that doesn't help. Because the pattern isn't about the specific workplace or the specific people. It's about how they process experience. They'll collect fragments in the new team too. They'll misunderstand feedback there too. They'll build cases against new co-workers because the problem isn't external, it's internal. It's the gap between what they record and what they understand. Moving to a new team temporarily feels like relief. New people, fresh start, no history. But within weeks or months, the pattern reasserts, because they bring their operating system with them. They bring their filter, they bring their archive, and they start adding new fragments to their collection. Different faces, different names, same pattern. And over time, the workplace becomes hostile. Not because it started that way, but because when you expect to be hurt, you find hurt everywhere. And when you find hurt everywhere, people eventually stop trying to connect. The isolation they feared becomes the isolation they create. What many people don't realize is that this pattern doesn't just hurt others, it destroys the person carrying it. Because living in constant misinterpretation is a form of chronic emotional dysregulation. For the person living this pattern, there is no peace. Every conversation leaves residue. Every interaction leaves questions. Every memory sits undigested, creating a weight that never lifts. They're not choosing to hold on. They simply don't know how to let go of something they never understood. Their body exists in a state of perpetual readiness. Because when you're carrying unprocessed memories, when you're holding fragments that never resolved, your nervous system can't fully relax. There's always something unfinished, something that needs attention, something that might mean danger even though you can't articulate why. This shows up physically, tension in the shoulders that never releases, a jaw that stays clenched without awareness, a stomach that churns for no obvious reason, sleep that doesn't restore because their mind replays conversations all night, dreams that loop through old conflicts, old confusions, old hurts that were never understood. They wake up exhausted, not because they didn't sleep, because they spent the night trying to decode memories that can't be decoded without information they don't have. The physical symptoms are real and often misattributed. They think they have digestive issues. They think they have TMJ. They think they have chronic fatigue. And maybe they do have those conditions, but often those conditions are manifestations of carrying unprocessed emotional experience. The body is trying to tell them something their mind hasn't been able to hear. You're holding too much. You don't understand what you're carrying. You need to release this, but they can't release it. Because release requires understanding, and understanding requires asking questions they've never learned to ask. During the day, they're hypervigilant, scanning every conversation for hidden meaning, monitoring every facial expression for signs of judgment, tracking every tonal shift as potential evidence of something wrong. It's exhausting. They don't even realize they're doing it. It's just how they experience the world. Constant low-level threat detection, constant data collection, constant preparation for the next hurt they'll remember but not understand. And here's what makes this particularly cruel. They're trying so hard. They're paying such close attention. They're investing enormous energy into understanding people, but they're investing in the wrong place. They're watching for signs of danger when they should be asking for clarification. They're collecting evidence when they should be seeking context. They're building cases when they should be building understanding. So despite all their effort, despite all their attention, they still get it wrong. They still misinterpret. They still conclude things that aren't true, and then they suffer from their own conclusions. They feel hurt by things that didn't happen. They feel rejected by people who weren't rejecting them. They feel attacked by comments that were neutral or even supportive, and that suffering is real, genuine, physical, even though its source is internal misinterpretation rather than external attack. This creates a profound loneliness, because they can't explain this to people. They can't say, "I record everything but understand nothing, and it's destroying me." They just feel perpetually misunderstood, perpetually hurt, perpetually confused about why relationships are so hard, why people keep disappointing them, why no one seems to understand what they're going through. But people can't understand what they're going through because they're going through something that isn't actually happening externally. They're suffering from their internal archive, from the way their mind processes and stores experience, from the gap between memory and meaning. And that's not something others can see or fix. It's something only they can address. But they don't know how, because awareness of the pattern is the first step, and they don't even know there is a pattern. They think everyone experiences relationships this way. Everyone holds on to memories. Everyone gets hurt and confused. Everyone struggles to let things go. They don't realize that most people process experiences differently. Most people ask questions when confused. Most people seek understanding rather than building assumptions. Most people let go of things once they're explained or resolved. But they never learned those skills, so they don't know they're missing them. The isolation deepens because they can't form lasting connections. Every relationship eventually founders on their misinterpretation. Every friendship hits a wall where the other person gets tired of being misquoted. Every professional relationship becomes strained under the weight of their case building, and they conclude that people are untrustworthy, that everyone eventually disappoints, that they're better off alone, but they're not actually better off alone. They're just protecting themselves from a pattern they don't understand they're creating. Over time, the weight accumulates, not just the weight of individual memories, but the weight of living in constant emotional reactivity. The weight of relationships that don't work. The weight of workplaces where they feel targeted. The weight of family dynamics they can't navigate. The weight of their own mind replaying and replaying and replaying, never finding resolution, because resolution requires understanding they don't have. Some people describe it as carrying a backpack full of stones. Each memory is a stone. Each unresolved fragment adds weight, and they've been collecting stones for so long since childhood that they don't remember what it felt like to walk without that weight. They think this is just what life feels like: heavy, tense, confusing, painful. They don't know there's another option. And the tragedy is that they're not refusing to move forward. They're trapped in a past they never fully entered. Because you can't let go of what you never held properly to begin with. And you can't heal what you never understood. This is where the cycle becomes clear. And clarity, even painful clarity, is the first step towards something different. Recognizing this pattern requires something most people avoid: honest observation without immediate judgment. Not, am I right or wrong, but am I remembering or misinterpreting? And that question feels dangerous, because if you've built your understanding of yourself on these memories, questioning them feels like losing your reality. But reality built on misunderstood fragments isn't reality. It's a construction, a narrative assembled from emotional data without factual verification. And the moment you're willing to question it, something shifts, not immediately, not completely. but enough to start. The first sign of this pattern in yourself is a specific kind of certainty. You remember things with crystal clarity. You can describe them in detail. You can feel the emotions as vividly as if they just happened. But if someone asked you what the other person was thinking, what they were trying to communicate, what context they were operating from, you realize you don't know. You never asked. You never wondered. You just concluded. Another sign is repetition. You find yourself telling the same story, about the same hurt multiple times, to different people in different contexts. The story never changes. The details stay fixed. And the emotional intensity doesn't fade. Because stories that get processed and integrated eventually lose their charge. They become things that happened, but stories that never got understood stay active. They remain current. They keep demanding attention because they were never resolved. A third sign is defensiveness. When someone offers a different perspective on your memory, when they say, "That's not how I remember it," or "That's not what I meant," you don't feel curious. You feel attacked, because their alternative explanation threatens your understanding of reality, and your understanding of reality is all you have. It's your only map of the world. Questioning it feels like freefall. People who process experiences with understanding respond differently to alternative perspectives. They feel curious, they ask questions, they explore the gap between their interpretation and someone else's. They're willing to discover they misunderstood because misunderstanding doesn't threaten their core sense of reality. It just means they need more information. But when your reality is built on unquestioned fragments, alternative perspectives feel like attacks on your sanity. A fourth sign is pattern language. You find yourself saying, "You always," or "You never," or "This is just like that time when." You're constantly connecting present moments to past fragments, seeing repetitions, building cases, proving that your interpretation is correct because look, it keeps happening. But what keeps happening is your interpretation, not necessarily the pattern itself. The difference between a real pattern and an interpreted pattern is this. A real pattern has consistency across multiple contexts with multiple witnesses. An interpreted pattern exists primarily in your memory and your storytelling. Others don't see it, or they see it completely differently, but you're certain it's there because you have evidence. Fragments you've collected and arranged into proof. Fifth sign is the inability to let things go. Someone apologizes, you accept. But the memory doesn't soften. Someone explains their intention. You hear them, but you still hold on to your interpretation. Someone demonstrates change. You acknowledge it, but you don't trust it. Because the fragment is more real to you than the present moment. The memory of being hurt carries more weight than the current evidence of repair. This happens because release requires processing. Processing requires understanding, and you never understood the thing to begin with, so you can't process it. You can only rehearse it, turn it over and over in your mind, examine it from every angle. But without new information, without actual understanding of what happened and why, that examination just reinforces the same conclusions you already reached. Recognizing this pattern in others requires different markers. You notice they quote you incorrectly, frequently, with absolute certainty. You said, and then they repeat something you definitely didn't say. Or you said it, but they've stripped all nuance and context. Or you said words that sound like that but meant something completely different. And when you try to correct them, they double down. They're sure. They remember clearly. Their memory is more real to them than your explanation. You also notice they bring things up repeatedly. Moments from months or years ago. Small comments you barely remember. Interactions you thought were resolved. And they present these moments as current evidence. Remember when you... as if the thing just happened yesterday. As if no time has passed. As if nothing that happened since then matters. Because for them, nothing has passed. The fragment is still active, still unresolved, still demanding acknowledgement. Another marker is their emotional intensity about things that seem disproportionate. You make a small mistake. They respond as if you've committed a major betrayal. You're slightly late. They interpret it as proof you don't care. You forget one thing. They add it to a long list of all the times you've failed them. The intensity doesn't match the moment, because they're not responding to just this moment. They're responding to this moment plus every other fragment they've connected to it. You'll also notice they struggle with ambiguity. They need to know what something means immediately. They push for clarity, for definition, for certainty, even when a situation is genuinely unclear. Because ambiguity is intolerable. Not knowing feels dangerous. So they rush to conclusions. They fill gaps with assumptions. They decide what something means so they can stop sitting in the discomfort of not knowing. But rushing to conclusions is how fragments form. It's how misunderstanding gets locked in. And perhaps most tellingly, you notice they feel perpetually misunderstood. By you, by others, by everyone. This is their consistent experience across relationships. They're always the one whose pain isn't being seen, whose perspective isn't being valued, whose truth isn't being acknowledged. And while it's possible that they actually are being consistently misunderstood, it's more likely that they're consistently misunderstanding. But they can't see that, because seeing that would require questioning the foundation of their reality. Here's the part that matters most. Recognizing this pattern is not about admitting you were wrong. It's about discovering you were confused. And confusion can be resolved. Being wrong feels like condemnation. Being confused is simply being human. So what do you do when you recognize this pattern? When you realize you've been holding fragments instead of truth? When you understand your certainty was actually assumption? The path forward doesn't begin with forgetting. It begins with questioning. Not questioning whether your pain was real, it was, but questioning whether your interpretation was accurate. And that distinction changes everything. The first step is separating emotional truth from factual truth. Your emotional truth is this: you felt hurt, dismissed, rejected, criticized, abandoned. That feeling is real. It happened. Your nervous system responded. Your body remembers. No one can tell you that you didn't feel what you felt. But emotional truth doesn't automatically reveal factual truth. The fact that you felt dismissed doesn't mean someone intended to dismiss you. The fact that you felt rejected doesn't mean someone was rejecting you. Feeling something and understanding its cause are two different things. This distinction is uncomfortable, because we're taught that our feelings are always valid, and they are. But validity of feeling doesn't equal accuracy of interpretation. Both things can be true. Your feeling was valid, your interpretation was inaccurate. And accepting that requires letting go of something most people hold tightly, the belief that if you felt it, it must have happened that way. The second step is learning to ask a question you probably never asked. What did they actually mean? Not what did it feel like they meant, not what do you think they meant, but what did they actually intend to communicate? And if you don't know, which you probably don't for most of your fragments, you have two options. You can ask them now, even if it's late. Or you can acknowledge that you don't know, that you never knew, that your certainty was a construction built in the absence of information. Asking late feels awkward. Hey, remember 3 years ago when you said that thing? What did you actually mean? It feels silly. It feels like reopening old wounds, but it's not reopening wounds. It's finally cleaning wounds that never healed because they were never understood. And most people, if they remember the moment at all, will be willing to explain. Not because they're admitting fault, but because they want to clear up misunderstanding. The third step is harder. It's sitting with uncertainty. It's being willing to say, I don't know what that meant, and leaving it there. Not rushing to fill the gap with assumption, not constructing an explanation that makes you feel better, just sitting in the discomfort of not knowing. This is nearly intolerable at first, because not knowing feels like vulnerability, like danger, like losing control, but not knowing is just reality. Most of the time, we don't actually know what others are thinking or intending. We guess, and when we mistake our guesses for knowledge, we create fragments. The fourth step is practicing context seeking. When you remember a moment that hurt, instead of just replaying the hurt, you ask new questions. What was happening in their life at that time? What stress were they under? What context was I missing? Were they dealing with something I didn't know about? Were they communicating something I didn't have the framework to understand? This doesn't excuse behavior that was genuinely harmful, but it often transforms understanding. The parent who was short with you wasn't rejecting you. They were drowning in financial stress. The friend who grew distant wasn't abandoning you. They were managing their own depression. The context changes the meaning without erasing the impact. The fifth step is accepting multiple truths. You felt hurt. They didn't intend to hurt you. Both things are true. This is hard because we want singular truth. We want someone to be right and someone to be wrong. We want clear villains and victims, but most human interactions don't work that way. Most pain happens in the gap between intention and impact, and closing that gap requires understanding both sides, not choosing one as more valid, holding both as real. The sixth step is the practice of checking your interpretations. Before you lock in a conclusion about what someone meant, before you add a new fragment to your archive, you pause, you notice the feeling, you acknowledge it. And then you ask, not accusingly, not defensively, just clearly. When you said that, what did you mean? Or, I'm noticing I'm feeling dismissed right now. Is that what you intended? Most of the time, the answer will be no, and that no is valuable information. It's the information you needed before you locked in a misunderstanding. This practice feels vulnerable. It feels like admitting you don't understand, like revealing confusion, like giving someone the opportunity to gaslight you. But actually, it's the opposite. It's refusing to gaslight yourself. It's choosing actual information over assumed interpretation. It's prioritizing understanding over the false certainty of fragments. The seventh step is revisiting old memories with curiosity instead of certainty. Take one fragment at a time, one memory that still hurts, one moment you've replayed 1,000 times, and instead of replaying your interpretation, you explore alternatives. What are 3 other possible explanations for what happened? What context might you have been missing? What if they weren't thinking about you at all? What if their behavior had nothing to do with you? Can you hold that possibility without feeling like you're betraying yourself? This process is uncomfortable. Because these fragments have been part of your identity. They've shaped your understanding of yourself and others. They've informed your decisions about who to trust and how to protect yourself. Questioning them feels like losing your footing. But that footing was on unstable ground anyway, built on assumptions rather than understanding. Rebuilding on actual understanding might feel shaky at first, but it's ultimately more solid. The 8th step is the hardest. It's grieving. Because as you start to understand what actually happened, as you separate feeling from fact, you'll discover things. You'll discover that some people you thought hurt you were actually trying to help. That some abandonments were actually boundaries. That some criticisms were actually concern. And that discovery brings grief. Grief for the years you spent hurt when you didn't need to be. Grief for the relationships you damaged based on misunderstanding. Grief for all the pain you carried that was never necessary. But that grief is also healing. Because grief is what happens when you finally process something. When you let it become part of your story instead of keeping it frozen in the present. When you understand it fully enough to integrate it and move forward. This is the grief you never got to experience because you never had the understanding required to process. Now you do, and it hurts, but it also releases. And this process is not quick, because you're not just reinterpreting memories. You're learning a completely new way of holding experience, but every fragment you understand becomes a memory you can finally put down. But here's what makes this difficult. Understanding requires something that feels unbearable at first. It requires letting go of certainty, and for people who've used certainty to manage chaos, that feels like freefall. Certainty is protective. When you're certain about what happened and why, you feel oriented. You know who to trust and who to avoid. You know what patterns to watch for. You know how to protect yourself. Uncertainty means none of that is stable. It means you might have been wrong. It means you might have hurt people based on misunderstanding. It means the world is more complicated and ambiguous than you wanted it to be. But certainty built on misunderstanding isn't actually protective. It's a false floor. It feels solid until you step on it hard, and then it collapses. Because it was never real to begin with. It was constructed from fragments and assumptions, and structures built from fragments eventually fail. Real protection comes from understanding, from accurate information, from knowing what actually happened and why, from being able to distinguish between genuine threat and misinterpretation, from responding to reality instead of to your archive. That's actual safety, not the false safety of certainty, the real safety of understanding. So letting go of certainty, while terrifying, is actually the path to something more stable. It's trading a false floor for ground that's actually solid. It's choosing confusion that can be resolved over clarity that was never real. It's accepting that you don't know everything, which paradoxically makes you more trustworthy to yourself and others. Because people who know they don't know are more careful, more curious, more willing to check their assumptions. And that creates actual accuracy instead of confident misunderstanding. If you love someone trapped in this pattern, you face an impossible dilemma. Stay and be perpetually misunderstood. Leave and confirm their worst fear, that everyone abandons them. But there's a third option most people never consider. Stay present while refusing to participate in their distortion. This requires boundaries you've probably never practiced. Because most people, when accused of something they didn't say or mean, immediately defend. They explain, they clarify, They try to prove their innocence, and this seems reasonable. But it doesn't work, because the person holding fragments isn't actually looking for your explanation. They're looking for validation of their interpretation, and your explanation threatens that. So they don't hear it as clarification. They hear it as denial, as gaslighting, as proof that you're exactly what they feared. So the first boundary is this: you stop defending yourself against misremembered accusations. Instead, you simply state reality. That's not what I said. Not defensively, not with extensive explanation, just clearly. I understand that's what you heard. That's not what I said. And then you stop. You don't elaborate. You don't prove. You don't convince. You just state the distinction and hold it. This feels wrong at first, because it feels like you're not taking their pain seriously, but you're not dismissing their pain. You're refusing to accept blame for pain you didn't cause. There's a difference. You can validate feelings without validating distortions. I hear that you're hurt. I understand this is painful for you, and I didn't say what you're remembering I said. Both of those things are true. The second boundary is refusing to be quoted incorrectly. When they say, "you said," and then present words you didn't use or meaning you didn't intend, you interrupt, not rudely, but clearly. I'm not going to discuss words I didn't say. If you want to talk about what I actually said, I'm here, but I won't defend against your interpretation. This feels harsh, but it's actually kind, because participating in their distortion doesn't help them. It reinforces the pattern. It confirms that their memory is accurate and you're the one who's confused. The third boundary is around historical evidence. When they bring up things from months or years ago as proof of current patterns, you can say something like, "I'm willing to discuss what's happening now. I'm not willing to relitigate the past." This doesn't mean the past doesn't matter. It means you're not going to participate in a system where every present moment gets filtered through accumulated fragments. If they want to address something old, that can be a separate conversation. But they don't get to use it as a weapon in unrelated current discussions. The fourth boundary is the hardest. It's the boundary around your own reality. When someone insists you meant something you didn't mean, did something you didn't do, said something you didn't say, you have to hold on to your own perception. This is where people often falter, because the other person is so certain, so emotional, so detailed in their memory. And you start to doubt yourself. Maybe I did say that. Maybe I don't remember correctly. Maybe they're right and I'm wrong. But if you know you didn't say it, if you're clear about what you meant, you don't abandon that clarity to accommodate their certainty. You can say, "I understand you remember it that way. I remember it differently, and I'm not going to accept your version as more accurate than mine just because you're more certain." This isn't about winning. It's about refusing to lose yourself in someone else's misunderstanding. The fifth boundary is about reciprocity. Understanding flows both ways or it doesn't flow at all. If someone demands that you understand their perspective but refuses to even consider yours, that's not a conversation. That's a power dynamic, and you can name it. I'm willing to try to understand your experience. I need you to be willing to try to understand mine. If you're not willing, we're not having a dialogue. We're having something else. When to insist on documentation becomes relevant when the pattern is severe. If someone routinely misremembers conversations to your detriment, you can suggest, "Let's put important conversations in writing. That way we both have a record of what was actually said." This often feels paranoid or hostile, but it's protective. And if they refuse, If they resist having an accurate record, that tells you something. It tells you they're more invested in their interpretations than in accuracy. There's also the boundary of validation versus agreement. You can validate someone's feelings without agreeing with their interpretation. I see you're in pain. I understand this is hard for you. I don't agree with your understanding of what happened. Those three statements can coexist. You're not dismissing them. You're also not accepting blame for something that didn't happen the way they remember. This distinction is crucial because many people confuse validation with agreement. They think if you care about them, you'll accept their version of reality. But caring doesn't require self-abandonment. Another important boundary is around therapy or outside help. If someone is trapped in this pattern severely enough that it's damaging the relationship, you can make continued engagement conditional on them seeking help, not as punishment, as recognition that you can't fix this. They need professional support to learn new patterns of processing experience, and if they refuse, you can make decisions about your own participation in the relationship accordingly. The question of when distance becomes necessary is deeply personal. But there are markers. If someone refuses to consider that they might misunderstand, if they consistently use misremembered past as weapons in present conflicts, if they interpret every boundary you set as evidence that you're the problem, if engaging with them leaves you feeling crazy or questioning your own reality, if the relationship has become entirely about managing their fragments rather than actually connecting, these are signs that distance isn't abandonment, it's protection. Distance doesn't have to be permanent, it doesn't have to be hostile. It can be, I care about you. I can't continue in a relationship where I'm constantly defending against things I didn't do. If you're willing to work on understanding rather than just holding on to your interpretations, I'm here, but I can't participate in this dynamic anymore. That's not a threat, it's a boundary, and boundaries are how caring people protect themselves and others from destructive patterns. You can hold compassion for someone while refusing to be their emotional regulator. You can understand why they developed this pattern while not accepting ongoing harm from it. You can wish them well while choosing not to be in relationship with them. None of this is cold or cruel, it's honest. And sometimes honesty is the kindest thing you can offer, because participating in someone's distortion doesn't help them. It enables them, it confirms their pattern, and it destroys you. Understanding this pattern does not mean enduring it forever. Compassion does not require self-erasure. You can recognize their pain without volunteering to be misunderstood indefinitely, because their healing is not your responsibility. Your presence is not their right. And your clarity is not up for negotiation. In the end, whether you're the one holding fragments or the one being held hostage by them, the same truth applies. Memory without understanding is not wisdom, it's just weight. Healing from this pattern doesn't look like most people expect. There's no single moment of clarity, no dramatic revelation. Instead, it's a slow thaw. A gradual shift from holding fragments to seeking stories, from defending interpretations to questioning assumptions, from carrying weight to building understanding. Healing begins in a small way, one memory at a time, one fragment taken out and examined with new questions. Not, why did they hurt me? But what was this really about? Not what did this mean about me, but what was happening in their world? Not how can I prove I was right, but is it possible I was confused? These questions don't come naturally. They feel like betrayal, like abandoning yourself, like siding with the people who hurt you. but they're not. They're siding with truth over interpretation, with understanding over assumption, with accuracy over comfortable certainty. And that shift, that willingness to question, is where healing starts. As you begin to ask different questions, you discover things, painful things, liberating things. You discover that the parent who was harsh wasn't cruel. They were overwhelmed. They were repeating the only parenting they knew. They were drowning in their own unmet needs and couldn't see yours. This doesn't erase the harm, but it changes the meaning. It transforms "they hurt me because I was bad" into "they hurt me because they were struggling." And that change, that shift in meaning, allows something new. It allows release. You discover that the friend who grew distant wasn't rejecting you. They were managing their own mental health crisis. They were pulling back from everyone, not just you. They were protecting themselves, not punishing you. And understanding that doesn't mean the abandonment didn't hurt. It just means the hurt had a different source than you thought. And different sources require different healing. You discover that the teacher who criticized wasn't targeting you. They were pushing you because they saw potential. Their standards were high because they believed you could meet them, and you interpreted rigor as rejection. You heard, "You can do better," as "you're not good enough." And you've carried that misunderstanding for decades, letting it shape your belief about your capabilities, about your worth, about whether effort matters. These discoveries are grieving moments because you realize you've been hurt by misunderstanding rather than by malice. You've been suffering from confusion rather than from attack. You've been defending against threats that weren't actually threats. And all those years of defense, all that energy spent protecting yourself, it was based on fragments that were never accurately understood. But grief is healing. Grief is what happens when something finally ends, when you stop keeping it alive through rehearsal and interpretation, when you let it become part of your history instead of your present. And that's what understanding offers. It offers completion. It offers the ability to say, "That happened, I understand what it was, and it's over now." As you practice this new way of holding memory, something else begins to shift. New experiences start forming differently. You notice yourself in conversations. You catch yourself making assumptions, and instead of locking them in, you pause, you check, you ask, "Is that what you meant?" Not defensively, curiously, genuinely wanting to know rather than wanting to be right. And people respond. Most of the time they say, "No, what I meant was," and they explain. And you hear something you would have missed entirely if you just concluded and moved on. You discover that clarification is possible. That misunderstanding can be corrected before it becomes a fragment. That understanding can happen in real time instead of decades later or never. This feels revolutionary, because you've spent so long believing that your first interpretation was the only interpretation, that your emotional reaction was accurate perception, that if you felt something, it must have been intended. And discovering that's not true, that there's space between feeling and fact, that creates possibility. The possibility of relationship without constant misunderstanding. The possibility of conflict that gets resolved instead of archived. The possibility of connection based on actual understanding rather than parallel interpretations. Your relationships begin to shift. Not always. Some people can't adjust to you being different. Some people need you to stay in the old pattern. But many people, the healthy ones, they respond to your new questions with relief. They've been trying to explain themselves for years, They've been offering clarification that you couldn't hear. And now you're finally asking, finally curious, finally willing to understand rather than just defend your interpretation. And that creates safety, real safety. The kind where both people can be honest because honesty leads to understanding rather than to being misquoted forever. You also notice something unexpected. You're less angry, because anger often comes from feeling wronged. And when you discover you weren't wronged, you were confused. The anger has nowhere to land. It dissipates. It transforms into something else. Sometimes sadness, sometimes compassion, sometimes just neutral acceptance. But the burning sense of injustice that fades. Because injustice requires intent. And you're discovering that most of what hurt you wasn't intentional. It was collision, misunderstanding. Two people operating from different frameworks and neither knowing how to bridge the gap. This doesn't mean you become passive. It doesn't mean you accept mistreatment. It means you get better at distinguishing between actual mistreatment and misunderstanding. Between people who need to be held accountable and people who need to be understood, between boundaries that protect you and boundaries that isolate you based on inaccurate threat assessment. That discernment, that's what understanding provides. The ability to respond accurately to what's actually happening, rather than to what you feared was happening. The physical changes are noticeable too. The tension in your body starts to release. Your sleep improves, not immediately, not completely, but gradually. Because your nervous system isn't constantly processing threat, isn't constantly managing fragments, isn't constantly prepared for the next hurt. You're living more in the present, less in the archive. And your body responds to that. It softens, it relaxes. It trusts that you're not in constant danger because you're finally seeing what's actually there instead of what you feared was there. You might notice you're more present in conversations. You're actually hearing what people say instead of filtering it through your expectations. You're responding to their actual words instead of to what their words triggered from your past. You're meeting them where they are instead of where your fragments told you they must be. And that presence, that real-time engagement, that's what connection actually feels like. That's what you were missing all those years you were recording, but not understanding. There will be setbacks. Old patterns are old for a reason. They're deeply grooved. They're automatic. You'll catch yourself slipping back into assumption, into collecting new fragments, into defending old interpretations. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's being human. The difference is now you notice. You catch yourself. You can course correct. You can pause and ask the questions you used to skip. You can choose understanding over comfortable certainty. And perhaps most importantly, you develop compassion for yourself. The self who collected all those fragments. The self who misunderstood and held on to misunderstanding. The self who hurt based on confusion. Because now you understand that self. You understand they were doing the best they could with what they knew. They were operating from a childhood template. They were trying to make sense of a confusing world. They were protecting themselves the only way they knew how, and they didn't know there was another way. So you stop condemning that past self. Stop being angry at yourself for all the years you got it wrong. Stop punishing yourself for the relationships you damage based on misunderstanding, because that self didn't have what you have now. They didn't have awareness. They didn't have tools. They didn't have the understanding that fragments aren't facts, and you can't fault someone for not knowing what they were never taught. This self-compassion is crucial, because healing happens in the context of kindness, When you're harsh with yourself about your past misunderstandings, you just create new fragments, new things to feel bad about, new evidence that you're broken or wrong or damaged. But when you meet your past confusion with understanding, when you recognize it as the reasonable result of your developmental experience, you create space for actual change, for learning, for becoming someone who understands rather than someone who collects. Over time, you start to notice a lightness, a sense of space that wasn't there before, because you're not carrying as much. You've put down fragments as you've understood them. You've released interpretations that were never accurate. You've let go of certainty that was never real, and what remains is actually much smaller, much more manageable, much more true. You're not free of all pain. You're not suddenly unburdened of all difficult memories, but you're relating to them differently. They're part of your story now instead of being your present reality. They're things that happened and shaped you, but they're not things that are still happening. They're not threats you need to constantly monitor. They're history, understood history, integrated history, history you can reference without being consumed by. And this is where true memory begins. Not when you remember everything, but when you understand enough. Not when you hold every fragment, but when you've processed what matters. Not when you've defended your version, but when you've discovered there were always multiple truths, and you were only seeing one. Because in the end, the most powerful shift is not about changing what you remember. It's about changing how you hold it. The most meaningful shift happens not when you finally understand every memory you've carried. It happens when you stop needing to. When you realize that some fragments will never become clear stories. Some confusion will never fully resolve. And that's not failure. That's being human. You don't need perfect understanding of the past to live clearly in the present. You don't need to decode every fragment. You don't need answers to every question. You don't need certainty about every hurt. What you need is the ability to live in the present moment without being held hostage by unprocessed past. And that's possible even with some mysteries remaining. Some memories will always be partial. Some misunderstandings will never get corrected because the people involved are gone or unreachable or have their own reasons for not engaging. Some questions will remain questions, and that's okay. You can hold those questions without letting them control you. You can say, I'll never fully understand what happened with that person, and I'm choosing to move forward anyway. This is different from denial. Denial says, it didn't matter. This says, it mattered, and I'm not going to keep suffering over something I can't fully resolve. Denial avoids. This acknowledges and releases. Denial creates new fragments. This integrates what can be integrated and makes peace with what can't. The goal isn't to decode every fragment. The goal is to stop letting fragments control you, to stop living in a past you never fully understood, to stop filtering present relationships through misunderstood history, to stop being the person who remembers everything and understands nothing, to become the person who understands enough to be present, enough to connect, enough to respond to what's actually happening rather than to what you fear might be happening based on old fragments. And that shift, that movement from past to present, that's liberation. Not because the past disappears, but because it stops being more real than now. It stops being more important than now. It stops determining now. You're here, fully, without the weight of unprocessed fragments pulling you back constantly, without the need to interpret every present moment through the lens of misunderstood past. This is what presence feels like. being in the actual conversation instead of the one your fragments tell you you're having, responding to the actual person in front of you instead of to the composite of everyone who hurt you, experiencing the actual moment instead of the echo of every similar moment you misunderstood. That's the peace that understanding brings. Not perfect understanding, enough understanding. You also discover that your worth is not dependent on understanding every hurt. For years, you've been trying to make sense of your pain, trying to organize it, trying to prove it was real, trying to get others to see it, trying to validate it through perfect memory and detailed accounts. And all of that was trying to establish your worth through your suffering, trying to prove that if you were hurt, you must matter. If you remember clearly, you must be right. If you can document it, you must be valuable. But worth doesn't come from pain. Worth doesn't come from perfect memory. Worth doesn't come from being right about who hurt you and how. Worth is inherent. It exists whether you understand the past or not, whether you remember correctly or not, whether you can prove your suffering or not, and accepting that, really accepting it, removes the pressure to maintain your fragments, because you no longer need them as evidence of your value. This is perhaps the deepest shift, moving from I matter because I was hurt to I matter regardless, moving from my memories prove my worth to my worth exists independent of my memories, moving from understanding my pain validates me to I'm valid whether I understand or not. That shift, that's freedom, real freedom, the freedom to put down fragments without feeling like you're putting down your identity, without feeling like you're betraying yourself, without feeling like you're letting people who hurt you off the hook. Because understanding that someone hurt you without meaning to doesn't let them off the hook. It just changes what the hook is. It changes what healing looks like. It changes what you need. You don't need them to be villains. You don't need to be the victim of intentional cruelty. You need to understand what happened, process it, and move forward. And that's possible whether they were malicious or just human, whether they meant to hurt you or were struggling themselves, whether they remember it your way or not. Living in the present breaks the pattern of living in misunderstood past. And living in the present means responding to what's happening now, not what happened before, not what you fear might happen based on before, just now. This person, this conversation, this moment. Is there threat here? Actual threat? Or is there just something that feels familiar? And familiar feels dangerous. Learning to tell the difference, that's the skill that changes everything. The quiet confidence of someone who no longer needs certainty to feel secure is unmistakable. It's not loud, it's not performative, it's just steady. They can say, I don't know what they meant and I'm okay with not knowing. They can say, that hurt and I don't need to fully understand why to move forward. They can say, I misunderstood and that doesn't make me worthless. That steadiness, that's what comes from building yourself on understanding rather than on fragments, on truth rather than on interpretation, on presence rather than on the past. What changes when you stop curating pain and start creating presence is profound. You stop being the person who brings up old hurts in new contexts. You stop being the person who can't let things go. You stop being the person whose relationships are defined by what went wrong in the past. You become the person who's here, who's engaged, who's willing to understand, who's capable of connection based on actual reality rather than on feared reality. You become someone others can trust, not because you're never hurt, not because you never misunderstand, but because when you do misunderstand, you're willing to discover it. You're willing to adjust. You're willing to say, I got that wrong. And that makes you safe. Because people know they won't be trapped in your misinterpretation forever. They know they can clarify. They know you're seeking accuracy, not defending your version at all costs. And that trustworthiness extends to yourself. You become someone you can trust. Because you're not operating from fragments anymore. You're not making decisions based on misunderstood past. You're not rejecting people because they remind you of someone else. You're not staying in situations that hurt you because you're still trying to decode old fragments through new experiences. You're making choices based on what's actually happening, on what you actually understand, on what's actually true, and that makes you reliable to yourself. The difference between someone trapped in fragments and someone standing in themselves is this: the trapped person is always looking backward, always referencing the past, always comparing, always defending their interpretation, always proving their hurt was real. The person standing in themselves is looking at what's here, at what's true now, at what's possible. They remember the past, but they're not living in it. They understand it without being controlled by it. They've processed it enough to be present, and that presence is something no one can take from you. Not with words, not with tone, not with subtle dismissal, not with rejection, not with misunderstanding. Because you're not dependent on external validation anymore. You're not building your reality from other people's fragments and your interpretations of them. You're building it from actual understanding, from presence, from choosing to be here rather than there, from choosing clarity over comfortable certainty, from choosing connection over the protection of holding on to misunderstood pain. In the end, your worth is not dependent on understanding every hurt. Your peace is not dependent on perfect memory. Your future is not dependent on making sense of every past confusion. What you need, what you've always needed, is permission to be here now, to stand in this moment, to respond to what's actually happening, to connect with what's actually true, to let go of what you never fully understood and probably never will. Because the most powerful response to a lifetime of holding fragments you never understood is not finally decoding them all. It's standing fully in this moment without needing to, without explanation, without perfect understanding, without leaving yourself behind in memories that were never fully yours to begin with. You are here now.